Welcome to this video, kindly sponsored by REC Watches. Now, back in World War II, in the Battle of Britain, it's often said that Britain stood alone, but that's not entirely true. A great many men from across the world came to help. Pat Hughes, an Australian, was one of them. He was an absolutely superb pilot. In just 3 weeks of flying, he notched up 17 victories against the Luftwaffe in X4009, a Mark I Spitfire. Unfortunately, his habit of getting a little too close to the aircraft he was shooting at took him out of the sky at the end of that period when his aircraft was struck by debris from his last victim. But about 2.5 decades later, his aircraft was found and excavated, and in the 21st century it was donated to the Hunter Fighter Collection for restoration. A lot of that material is being used in the restoration, but some parts of it can't be, and that's where REC come in. They've produced a line of watches which incorporate some elements of X4009 into them, and some of the proceeds will help in the restoration of this legendary aircraft. If you'd like to own one, the latest batch are available with a 25% pre-order discount at the REC website, link below in the video description. So thanks very much to REC, and speaking of other things Australians are good at restoring, HMS Castlemaine. Now, for those of you who are thinking, hang on Drac, I'm sure you went to other places in Perth other than Rottnest Island on your Australia trip. Yes, you're correct. There were a couple of excellent museums that I visited, and we will be looking at those in due course. However, today we're going to move forward briefly to the next city in line on the Australia tour last year, at least at the time of recording, and that, of course, was Melbourne. Melbourne saw quite a few different attractions visited: the wreck of HMAS Cerberus, a bunch of coastal fortifications, a submarine that's quite literally just lying on its side in a marina. But today we're looking at HMAS Castlemaine, and this, honestly, I have to say, is probably the single best restored museum ship that I've been on, or certainly in the top 3. Now, bear in mind, there is a difference between restored and condition. So, there are lots of museum ships in absolutely excellent condition, but quite a lot of them have arrived either out of naval service or out of naval reserve in reasonable states and then been maintained. As we'll see a bit later on, Castlemaine has been extremely heavily restored and is in really good condition. So all praise to her crew. As I said to some of them at the time, if you told me that she'd been the ceremonial flagship of the Royal Australian Navy before being handed straight into museum service, I wouldn't have doubted it. As you can see from this aerial photo I took on my drone, she's really well kept. But let's learn a little bit more about the ship and then we'll go aboard. Castlemaine was one of 60 Bathurst-class corvettes built in Australia, 56 of them for the Royal Australian Navy and 4 for the Indian Navy. Now, whilst if you've seen the video on Sackville, you might recognise the general layout as being somewhat similar to a Flower-class corvette, and indeed that was kind of the starting point of the design, the Bathurst class was drawn up by the Australians with adaptations and improvements compared to the Flower class, specifically for the kind of service that they thought the ships would experience in Pacific and Indian Ocean waters. Castlemaine herself was the third of 8 vessels laid down in the Williamstown dockyard, and she had her keel laid on the 17th of February 1941. She was launched not long thereafter on the 7th of August, and commissioned the following year on the 17th of June 1942. Once launched, she would see extensive service in the Pacific theatre throughout the rest of the Second World War, including in the Timor Sea and around New Guinea, not just on anti-submarine patrol and minesweeping operations, which is what she'd been designed for, but also carrying troops and stores to and from that particular theatre. She did also do the more regular and expected escort work, escorting various merchant ships, and her convoys came under attack a number of times. Despite her relatively small size, you can see, people to scale on the ship in this drone footage. She could actually carry up to 300 troops if you absolutely had to, albeit the supplies would not last terribly long in that case, so it would have to be a relatively short journey. Her final assignment in the Second World War consisted of supporting the reoccupation of Hong Kong in September 1945, because remember, a lot of the Japanese garrisons needed to have their surrenders individually taken. And during the Second World War, she ended up steaming almost 120,000 miles. Not bad for a little ship that only displaces about 650 tons soaking wet, and thanks to her minesweeping provenance, only draws 8.5 foot of water. One of the differences between a Bathurst and a Flower class is the Flower class only has a single screw, whereas the Bathurst has 2 screws, each driven by a vertical triple expansion engine. But top speed is similar, with various ships of both classes able to do between 15 and 16 knots. This isn't exactly going to set any speed records, but is more than enough to escort most merchant convoys. The only downside of this particular speed regimen is that it means corvettes tended to have to stick fairly close to their convoys, because the speed differential wasn't enough for them to usually be able to easily catch up if they went tearing up off after U-boats in the distance, which is why frigates and escort destroyers were invented. With the potential for air attack from Japanese aircraft a little bit more prevalent in the Western Pacific and Indian Ocean than perhaps air attack from the Luftwaffe could be thought of as a threat in the mid-Atlantic, she is equipped with a somewhat heavier anti-aircraft armament, which we will look at a little bit later on. You can see some of the visitors aboard Castlemaine exercising the aft 40mm Bofors there. But she is, of course, primarily an anti-submarine warfare vessel. The guns, if not being used in the anti-aircraft role, have a limited anti-surface role, but that would be particularly useful if, say, a submarine pops up nearby, because some of those big Japanese submarines were quite heavily armed. Castlemaine's active duty service came to an end in December 1945, when she was decommissioned. She would later become a training vessel, and then eventually, as we'll cover a bit later on, would wind up as a museum ship. She is one of 2 surviving Bathurst class, the other one being HMAS Whyalla, or Whyalla possibly, which is on land, which means that Castlemaine is the last remaining one afloat. These days, she's run as a museum. She's a completely non-profit organisation. Everybody aboard is a volunteer, and therefore they rely on the visiting public and their admission fees and the little gift shop to keep the ship afloat and in operational condition. So if you do happen to find yourself in Melbourne and you can find your way to the Gem Pier, please definitely go and visit. It is a really, really excellent experience. Plus, there's also a surprisingly good fish and chip shop at the land side of the pier. Luckily, although she spent a fair bit of time as a training ship, there wasn't a huge amount to cut back to restore her to a World War II condition. The main difficulty when that project was undertaken was actually finding bits to restore back onto her, things that had been taken off the ship rather than modern stuff that had been added on. But, there's the result, gradually, descending relative to your point of view, in the wonderful waters of Melbourne Harbour. So, shall we step aboard?
Now, this is our first World War II era ship of the tour, and as you can see, we're starting at the bow, so we're going to start on the upper decks and work our way aft and then head further below. So starting off, we have, of course, the anchor machinery. This is all in remarkably good condition. You're going to see that more and more as we go around the ship, but just coming up here, the condition this vessel is in is absolutely great. So obviously right at the bow, you've got your flag. This being a slightly later design, not adapted from a whaler, we actually have a forecastle that's quite high off the water actually for a ship of this size, which is going to give it better sea keeping. And you'll see the shape of the bow as well is actually much better for sea keeping, which hopefully there will be a picture appearing right here, or maybe over here. I don't know where I am in the frame. Now, we're going to just swing around 180 degrees and have a look at the first bit of the ship's armament. That's the deck gun. And you'll be surprised there as well, as there's a few additional features that you don't see in most escorts deck guns from the early part of the war. So what we have here is a 4-inch deck gun. Now you might be thinking, well, that's not exactly unusual for a British or Commonwealth escort of World War II, and you'd be correct. A 4-inch deck gun is pretty much the standard. However, one thing you might notice is, compared to a lot, this barrel is somewhat longer, and also it's somewhat higher off of the deck. And if you look At the mounting, you'll also notice that the manual sights as well as the opening for the gun itself are considerably higher. Now the reason for that is that this is a HA gun, which is a high angle gun, a dual purpose gun. This is a 4-inch Mark 13, I believe, maybe 23, but I think the marking says 13, which means that it can actually be used against aircraft. Now you'll recall quite a lot of Escorts, Flower class, River class, etc., a lot of the earlier war-built ones, their deck guns tended to be either single purpose, i.e. anti-surface, or maybe dual purpose, but probably in name only. Whereas this is a fully capable 4-inch gun. And not only that, they've actually kept this gun in such a condition that you can work and train it. So with the assistance of 1 or 2 subscribers who have shown up, we're actually going to get this thing moving. So hope no one else shows up, because they might get clocked in the head by a 4-inch gun. But they really should have seen that one coming. Okay, so we now have 2 men. I'm on the left controlling the vertical, and we've got someone on the right controlling the horizontal. So if we train to port low, so imagining a radar on the port side, surface target as fast as we can. Let's go. Okay, and now we're going to go for incoming aircraft on the starboard side, so starboard and high as fast as we can. And then back to central position. Now that is an experience you don't usually have. Now unfortunately the breech block has been welded up completely, so there's no chance of this thing being made operational anytime soon. Timber. Oh, is it only timber? Correction, it may be made operational very soon. So with regards to what I said before, I've just found the plate, and the plate says 4-inch HALA-MTG, Mark 23, in fact, made by the Ordnance Factory in either Bendigo or Dendigo.
Bendigo.
Bendigo, there you go. It's useful having an Australian around. Examined at Bendigo 1944, and this is gun number 100. So you've just got your 2 side plates here. Again, we'll have a photo or something, and your central pedestal. So this is an above deck mount. There's also some really, really nice artwork on the side here, which shows the aggression of the crew, which again, we'll be cutting in a side piece. Right, so this either side of the 4-inch gun, we have one of these. This one's painted green because it's on the starboard side. The other one has a red nose. This is a paravane. You've probably seen a few other paravanes on other ships. There's one on Texas. There's several on some of the vessels we've looked at before. This one is a little bit more bulbous, a little bit kind of like a short torpedo, as opposed to the other ones, which tend to be cylindrical. And you can see how it's set up. So this is how it will be attached to chains. They'll be run down there. And then you've got these fins. Now, it wouldn't run through the water like this. It would run through the water, basically turn 90 degrees. So this will be pointing that way. These fins will keep it stable and pull it away from the ship. And that will keep the chain taut between the ship and the paravane, which then means it will be the chain that does the anti-mine work, because that will cut through the mooring line for the mine. And then the mine will pop to the surface, where anyone with anything bigger than a rifle, or potentially a rifle if you're a good shot, can then take it out. So pop that back down there. This is just for handling. And of course, different shaped paravanes work better at different speeds. This being a small Escort doesn't really need to go particularly quickly, so it can afford to have a slightly more bulbous, slightly heavier paravane, which will then have a bit more cutting power, which is necessary because of the overall slower speed that it's going to be traveling at. So the ship has additional anti-aircraft defense, apart from the 4-inch high angle up front, in the form of 2 20mm Oerlikons either side of the bridge on the wings. The one on the starboard side is no longer present, there's just the mounting point, but the one on the port side is still here. Now, because this is a very small ship, so to give you some idea, this is the bridge wing, so this is basically parallel with the port side of the ship, and then coming past the gun, this is where the superstructure starts, and where the camera is the center of the ship. So it's not particularly wide, there's not a lot of space, and from the ladder here to the hatch into the bridge is just here. So for visitor safety, you'll notice there's a cable there which stops me from slewing it all the way across, and I suppose also the barrel, if it's too low, will probably clonk there, but we can bring it around to about there so you can see the front of the barrel. Standard 20mm Oerlikon. This is not really proof against much other than maybe shrapnel. You know, even a machine gun round is going to go through this, but it's better than nothing. You have your canister for your 20mm rounds. There would have been a bunch more all around here, and this doesn't have a gun pit because, again, this is just a bridge wing, so you would mount it with your shoulders like this and then elevate and lower it. Obviously this has been locked in place, and that provides you with probably, as long as you don't want to hit anything aft, probably about 180, maybe 200 degree arc of fire to defend the port side of the ship, and then your corresponding one on the starboard side. Although interestingly, it does mean that if a plane is making a direct attack run to the bow or stern of the ship, these guns probably can't actually bear on the attacker, so forward you'd either be relying on the 4-inch or on the captain to take the ship to port or starboard to unmask one of these. But there is a heavier Bofors 40mm aft, which we'll look at a bit later. And to give you some idea how compact this all is, the camera is now about 1.5 meters away from the Oerlikon and moved about 1 meter from where it was before. This is one of the 2 flag lockers. We've got one here and one just over there, and they're right below the signal halyards. So if you need to send a signal to someone by flag, which is, to be honest, your main form of signaling in World War II, you do have radio to a certain degree, but if you want emissions security or just more day-to-day general practice, or you want more than one person to know what you're doing, flags are what you need to have. Now, they are flying a 4-flag signal at the moment, so picture will be appearing just after this, and then once again, you know, down in the comments, see if you can work out what that signal says.
And here's the signal in question, seen from below, and with a little bit more zoom in. Now, I appreciate you might not be able to work out exactly what those top flags are, so if we look at a drone shot, we can zoom in and you can see all the way there on the port side halyard is that signal flying quite happily in the breeze. You notice there's also the white ensign aft, which is correct for the period because, of course, World War II.
Right, so we're now on the aft end of Castlemaine superstructure. This is, of course, a Bofors 40mm gun. This wasn't originally her aft armament. We've seen the 20mm forward. As originally launched, the 20mm would have been here, and there would have been a pair of Lewis guns on the bridge wings, but fortunately somebody sane turned around and reckoned that a Lewis gun is not the world's best anti-aircraft weapon for World War II, and so they decided, right, we're going to put something a bit heavier. So this is the Bofors 40mm, and very gently we're going to spin it around starboard, and then we're going to spin it to port, so because this is very well maintained, so it still works, and then bring it back to the center. The glamorous assistant over on the left is going to bring it up or down, and then we'll put it back up again so we don't take out half of the people who are watching. And then we're going to do a much faster track. So you'll have seen on the US battleships how quickly, or lack of quickly, the manual slew is on a quad, which obviously weighs considerably more. But if we're in a bit of urgency and somebody's coming in to the port side, then I'm a terrible person because I just sent to the starboard side. But assuming we're going to So yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily something you'd want to be doing when the enemy is at close range, but if an aircraft is at longer range, you've got your manual sights, so actually tracking across the sky of aircraft that's over 1,000 yards away is not actually out of the realms of possibility. And of course, towards the end of the war, they would have been talking about kamikaze attacks, which means they line up on you, you line up on them, and then it's a question of how many 40mm rounds can you get close to them before they get uncomfortably close to you.
Now, thanks to a slightly dodgy battery, that was all the footage I managed to get of the ship on the day, apart from the drone footage you've seen earlier. I do have some film footage of the engine room that was taken on a slightly less steady cam, but I think the engine room tour is probably a subject for a separate video at some point, maybe looking more broadly at machinery. However, We do have a bunch of static photos as well, so we can look around a few other bits and pieces up here on the upper decks of Castlemaine, starting with, of course, the bridge, or perhaps more accurately, the superstructure in general. As you can see, it's not the world's most elegant or aesthetically pleasing of units. It is a big metal box, but it works, and that's the important thing. Now, up here on the bridge, you can see a wide variety of different bits of equipment. On the left there, you've got some voice pipes for communication without the need for power. You, of course, have the ship's wheel in the middle there. And just ahead of that, with the red and green balancing ferrous masses next to it, is, of course, the ship's compass. But what's this on the little tripod closer to us? Well, the ship has multiple compasses. You have, of course, the traditional magnetic compass, as we said, with the balancing ferrous masses either side of it, because, of course, the hull is ferrous, and without those, the compass would point in all sorts of directions, except the one it's actually supposed to. And you can also see there we've got a little inclinometer, so you can tell how much the ship is leaning at the time that you're reading off of the compass. But ships of this period had, as we said, not just more than one compass, but more than one type of compass. The one on the grey tripod you saw in the foreground of the earlier photo, as you can see here from this look down on it, is a Sperry gyro compass. Now that's quite important because, of course, something could happen to affect the magnetic compass, whereas the powered gyro compass, in theory, should not be subject to the same problems. And now, of course, something like a major heavy hit down where the gyro is could affect the gyro compass, and therefore you'd fall back on the magnetic compass for navigation, which means that it's not just a case of, oh, we have two compasses, and something, when, you know, someone smashes one or a bullet goes through one, will be fine. This actually ensures that the ship is proof against very specific types of failure that might wipe out the functionality of one or the other of these two units. And here, not only do we have, obviously, a voice tube there on the left, but on the right we have two ceasefire buttons. Now, it might not be clear unless you've got a particularly large screen, but the two ceasefire buttons actually say ceasefire 0.303 port and ceasefire 0.5 mg starboard. So as well as the Oerlikons on the bridge wings, that 40mm Bofors centre aft, and the 4-inch forward, the ship also has an array of small caliber machine guns to defend itself with. Now, machine guns, not necessarily the most potent or effective anti-aircraft defense weapons in World War II, even on a ship of this size, but one, it's better than nothing, and two, still quite effective against submarines and small craft, which the Castlemaine may have expected to encounter during its war service. Out in the open is a relatively rare thing. This is a radar screen that's designed for functionality in the open elements. When you look at most World War II museum ships, you'll see that they tucked away their radar equipment well under cover and sometimes well under armour as well, in the case of some later CICs. But space is at such a premium aboard Castlemaine that something like this, which, whilst not necessarily a particularly late edition, is still something that's very, very new at the time the ship is being built, just has to be put wherever there is space available. And if that space happens to be right at the edge of the enclosed structure, you can just see the hatchway out there to the right, then you're going to have to just live with it. Now, those of you who are aficionados of Star Trek the original series might think this looks a lot like Mr. Spock's science scanner viewing area, and well, this is pretty much where the inspiration came from. Obviously it's not unique to Castlemaine, but a lot of World War II radar sets that had to operate either in the open or in strong light conditions would have these viewing hoods so that you could actually see what the relatively weak phosphor screen was showing you. Now, they haven't actually powered up the radar, but they've put on a kind of tracery, so it gives you some idea looking down what a radar operator might expect to see. At least, you know, this is an interpretation of it. The bit in the middle is more like what you would actually see with this kind of radar, with kind of an overlaid map put there to give you some context of where you actually are, because, you know, coastlines don't tend to neatly outline themselves naturally. Now, again, if you've got a big screen, you might be able to read this yourself, but for those of you who might be watching on mobile, these are the dials and buttons by which you would actually control what you see on the radar. And of course, you'd have to learn what each of these was by feel, because your head's going to be stuck on that viewing tube, which potentially in part explains the various different shapes, or it could just be that those are the replacements that came about over time. Who knows? Anyway, this says on the top left, the plate PPI unit, because this is the more advanced non-oscilloscope version of radar, Royal Australian Navy pattern number 520, and it's serial number 145. The button on the far left, or the dial, is the range, so that'll show you kind of a zoom in or zoom out, and you've got three settings, A, B, or C. It's currently set to B. You've then got centering, and then you've got dimmer, so you can make it brighter or darker. The little button just above dimmer is the bearing set. You've then got course mark, video gain, and finally, on the far right, calibrate. And speaking of electronic sensors you should really pay attention to, the ASDEC hutch, or what we call sonar. And yeah, it pretty much is a hutch. In fact, I'm fairly sure in some countries, if you kept a rabbit in something this size, you would probably be done for animal cruelty. But nonetheless, if you were the ASDEC operator, this is where you got to sit, in a nice enclosed wooden box, in a very, very hot tin box on a very, very warm ocean. I hope they kept him topped up with lemonade. As you can see, he's got his very own voice pipe to communicate, the actual equipment there, and a little wooden stool to sit on. And that is about as basic as it gets for very early sonar equipment. To be honest, he's probably got it relatively good, because as you'll see a little bit later in the year when we look at Diamantina, they've actually got it even worse. So here's a slightly closer look at the equipment. Very much more akin to the older radar equipment than the PPI scoped radar that's aboard the ship now, and indeed, sonar equipment as you would occasionally be portrayed later on, albeit the kind of waterfall display, which is what you can get up there on the top left, albeit in a very crude form, is still more along the lines of what you'd be looking at with at least passive sonar and then active. Now, just atop the bridge superstructure and looking aft, there is a searchlight dash signal light. As you can see, it's got the multiple shutters there, so you can use it to signal things in Morse code or use it to point at various things that you might want illuminated at various stages. And this part of the ship is not actually usually accessible to visitors. So you can see some of the guys down there. They're on the bridge level. That is the highest level you normally get to. But the crew were kind enough to unsafety catch, I don't know what it's called, blanking plate, I think, unblanking plate then, the ladder that allows you to actually stand on top of the superstructure, which allows you to then access this platform and, in theory, if you were mad enough, go up the mast. But one, as you probably already gathered from one of my videos in USS New Jersey, I'm not the world's best person for heights, and two, this is about as high as you can safely go. You might get away with going up the rungs up the mast, but they couldn't necessarily guarantee it, so I didn't. Now, in contrast to some of the anti-submarine escorts that the Axis powers had, by the point that Castlemaine entered service, even these relatively dinky, three-figure displacement Allied escorts had considerable amounts of electronics aboard. So the electronics that are represented on the ship, as she is at the moment, include a high-frequency direction finder set, a medium-frequency and a low-frequency receiver. You've also got the ASDIC, which we've already seen, and two types of radar, Type 272 and Type 286. So you've got two radars, three different kinds of radio receiver and direction finding equipment, plus a sonar, plus, of course, some IFF markers as well. Some of those systems are contained in this rather fetching two-tone grey dustbin-style installation partway up the mast. And then right up the top of the foremast there, you can see one of the radar antenna. Obviously, that radar can do a full 360, and tucked underneath the dustbin there, you can also see there's that searchlight spotlight position and signal lamp. So, again, emphasizing just how compact this ship really is. Also to be found, right up at the top here, a pair of ship's binoculars. There would have been several of these mounted to allow lookouts to sweep all around the ship. And of course, this enhances the vision of the Mark I human eyeball, so you can spot things really far away in a bit more detail. and with lenses this size also has a degree of low light gathering capability, although not quite as much as some, such as the Japanese night optics. But hey, that's why you have the radar. And there's the Melbourne city skyline off there to the right, and some industrial cranes on one of the waterfronts dead ahead. You can actually look through these binoculars. As you can see, they are manipulatable as well, but it turns out with the camera I was using, I couldn't get a decent shot through my camera lens, through the binocular lens, to show you what you can see through said lenses. I think, as far as I can tell from my experience, that only really works with mobile phone cameras, and I think my mobile at this point was in a bag further down in the bridge superstructure. There's also a Kali float, or a very close relative thereof. Now, these, as I've mentioned in a few other videos, you will see scattered around, especially British and Commonwealth ships in World War II, and at first glance, it might look like some kind of primitive rubber raft or rubber dinghy, but it's actually not. One of the things that had been appreciated was that ship's boats would probably end up being smashed or holed by the time a ship got into a sinking condition and you actually needed to use them. And, well, rubber inflatable stuff likewise would get punctured. So although this resembles a rubber dinghy, what this actually is a fairly solid outer ring made of buoyant but, as I said, solid materials. Exactly what you put in it depended on who was manufacturing it. And that slatted wooden area in the middle is suspended from your buoyancy ring, and that will actually just, well, if you throw it in the water, being wood, it will float, but once you have people in it, that will actually sink slightly below the water, so it's more of a safety container for people rather than a full-on waterproof raft. And that would at least keep you alive for a little bit. There would be some emergency supplies either stored in or nearby in wartime as well. And so when you see people talking about Kali floats, this kind of thing and some larger variants are pretty much what you're looking at. The advantage, of course, of having a solid but buoyant method of flotation is that this thing can be riddled with shrapnel and bullets, etc., etc., and it doesn't really actually compromise its ability to float all that much. About the only hazard is that it is, of course, slightly flammable, but hopefully if the ship's on fire, you'd be taking this thing away from the ship rather than leaving it to burn. Now, of course, at the aft end, we've already seen those two paravanes, or we saw one of them in the video, now you can see the other one, but you can again appreciate just how small this ship is when you look at how cluttered this deck space is. You can see on the right-hand side of the picture, the port side of the ship, you've got the 303 machine gun that was mentioned up on the bridge. You've also got the position, but not the actual gun itself for the 50 cal, which is on the starboard side. Then you've got these two big winch assemblies here in the foreground, which is what's necessary to actually stream the paravanes. You've got the two little cranes at the back to lower them over the sides. Now, on a battleship, all of this would be incidental. On a 600 plus ton Corvette, this is, occupying huge amounts of real estate. Now, hiding amongst all that is actually some traditional depth charges. A ship like Castlemaine would typically be carrying about 50 depth charges, at least on paper, during her active service career. Obviously, the crew usually would stash a few away elsewhere as well. These are on the aft fantail, so you might be able to spot them hiding away in that main picture we saw a little bit earlier. And the ship lists that they would carry 30 normal depth charges and 20 heavy depth charges, which presumably means a lot more explosive. Probably the ones on the aft, and the normal ones would be on the projectors either side. There's also a mine aboard, because what makes a good minesweeper also makes a good mine layer, and so the ship would carry mines occasionally if necessary in order to disrupt enemy shipping, although not really a typical activity of a corvette, because mine laying usually, unless you're mining known passages for enemy submarines, tends to be a rather front-line duty, and while the Bathurst class were combat vessels, you probably don't want to take a 15-knot ship right up in the face of the Imperial Japanese Navy for most of the war. But speaking of things that can be projected into the sea, you can see just behind there one of the depth charge projectors. This particular unit is known as a Depth Charge Thrower Mark II, and it can catapult that depth charge about 40 yards or so. These are also known as depth charge mortars or sometimes depth charge guns, depending on the shape of the actual launcher. Can be known as a K gun or a Y gun as well, and that is because they are essentially small cannon. They use an explosive charge to generate pressure, which then catapults off the depth charge itself. The main difference between this and an actual cannon is that in an actual cannon you would load the shell into the gun and you'd have an open bore and away the shell would go. In this case, however, as you can see, the depth charge is mounted in this holder or yoke, and so when the charge goes off, you can see there's a little compressed gas bottle up there which helps to store the gases produced by the explosion of the charge, and so it's more like a big shove. So this yoke will then be projected forward and the depth charge with it, but of course the depth charge will not be held in. The safety pin will have been removed, and so when the yoke comes to a short and sharp stop, the depth charge continues going. The useful thing about this kind of projector is, of course, it projects over the side, in this case over the starboard side, which shortens the gap between the loss of the ASDIC contact as the ship passes over the target and the dropping of the charges on the enemy submarine. You'll note that this ship is too small in the way it's configured to have a Hedgehog launcher installed, which would give it a forward throwing capability against enemy subs. Now, one of the other fun working things aboard the ship is the engine telegraph. Now, you might be more used to seeing a lot of engine telegraphs that are more vertically mounted, i.e. the cylinder or disc, depending on the type of telegraph, will have its face vertical, as opposed to here where the face is horizontal, and there'll be a lever which goes up, over and around it. In this case, however, you have a dial which you have to wheel quite a bit to change the indicator position, which obviously will then relay down into the engine room below. Well, let's see it working then.
I can't believe an operator setting that.
Now, I did mention briefly Castlemaine did have a little bit of a life after the Second World War, so we'll just go into that in a little bit more detail by way of rounding up this video. The ship spent about a decade in the reserve fleet before it was allocated as a training vessel, which we mentioned earlier. Specifically, she was supposed to be a training vessel for engine room artificers and shipwrights. That meant that most of her equipment above decks, all the stuff we've seen so far, was considered unnecessary, and that was all stripped away. So that would later on have to be restored. So this is her as her training vessel. You can see pretty bare. Some of her interior spaces were also converted to training uses, including damage control training compartments and so forth. But as time moved on, she became less and less relevant in this role because, of course, she had vertical triple expansion engines, and by the mid-1960s, these were somewhat vanishingly rare bits of equipment in the Royal Australian Navy generally, and therefore not quite so relevant for training up new engineers. In 1969, she was listed for disposal, and it seemed that she would follow most of her sisters to the scrapyard, but a volunteer group that was actually initially looking at trying to preserve the ironclad HMVS Cerberus expanded its scope to also try and preserve Castlemaine. And as you can see from these photos, well, she wasn't in the world's best condition. In fact, I'm going to read an extract from HMS Castlemaine's website, which describes the situation they were facing. So originally, the HMVS Cerberus Trust existed. It was then converted into the Maritime Trust of Australia, and that was established in 1974 to take responsibility for the restoration and preservation of the ship. By then, Castlemaine was little more than a rusty and gutted hulk, stripped of all her deck fittings, winches and armament. Inside was not much better. There were neither light fittings nor bridge equipment. Below decks, the engines and boilers were all in pieces. The work to transfer the ship from HMAS Cerberus to Melbourne began in earnest. The ship had to be hammer-tested and surveyed for the return to Melbourne and her role as a historic vessel. A detailed inspection of the engines and boilers found it too costly for them to be readied for the ship to proceed under her own steam. Arrangements were then made for a tow, and in February 1974 a party of volunteers arrived on the ship to prepare her for sea and the long tow back to Melbourne, because HMS Cerberus, incidentally, is a training establishment. HMVS Cerberus is the ironclad wreck. The Melbourne Harbour Trust Commissioners offered the use of a berth at South Wharf just below Duke and Orr's dry dock, which is now the permanent berth of the Polly Woodside. HMS Castlemaine was towed from HMS Cerberus to her new berth in June 1974, and once she was safely secured alongside, her cleaning and restoration began. The ship was open to the public almost immediately. Negotiations began with the Victoria government for the lease of the Duke and Orr site, but before this was completed it was announced that a new river crossing would be built downstream, and this would effectively landlock Castlemaine. The Maritime Trust then commenced negotiations with the Melbourne Harbour Trust to berth the ship at Gem Pier, Williamstown, near the shipyard in which she was built. Those negotiations were successful, and the vessel was moved on to her new berth in September 1976. And as you could see from the previous photos, they had a lot of work to do, but as you can see from this photo in the engine room, they've done a fantastic job. So thanks once again, of course, to the volunteer crew of HMS Castlemaine for letting us all aboard and letting us tour the ship pretty much wherever we liked. And obviously thanks again also to all you wonderful subscribers down in Australia who showed up to say hello, and those of you who both agreed to appear on camera helping man the various guns and tracking the drone as it made its way around the ship for a little bit of extra entertainment. So once more, obviously, if you do happen to find yourself in Melbourne, do go give good old Castlemaine a visit. You will not be disappointed. It's a wonderful ship, definitely needs to continue to be preserved, and hopefully she will remain at Gem Pier for a good long time to come. So next time we tune back into Australia, we will be actually back in Perth, but again, that's for another video. Thanks now.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.